Hello and welcome to Soul Portals, exploring psychospiritual horizons with your hosts Cedric Spire and Deanna Nagel. Cedric is an author and therapist who developed the interview guidance model and is a pathfinder in the psychospiritual realm. Deanna created the Essential Soul Care model, a model suitable for therapists, coaches, and healers. The monthly episodes of Soul Portals feature guests sharing insights from their personal paths and professional practices. Thank you for tuning in for the Soul Talk with all kinds of trailblazing teachers and guides as Cedric, Deanna, and guests explore new evolutionary landscapes.
This is Soul Portals, which is the live session being recorded for the Soul Portals podcast. And your hosts are Cedric Spire and myself, Deanna Nagel. And we meet once a month. And we talk about soul portals. We talk about psychospiritual dynamics with our guest. And so today, it's in honor of Valentine's Day coming up. And just want to give you some housekeeping issues. If you've got any tech issues, Wesley is here from Online Events to help us out with that. So just put something in the chat to him. Also, if you have questions for the speaker, please just put that in the chat and we'll get to that as we go along. And I think that's the opening introduction to what we do here.
Yep, welcome again. And we have an opening invocation, which goes like this. May the spirit flow freely through our conversation and this gathering, allowing it to be both energizing and edifying. So Malcolm is our portal for the theme, relationships as a spiritual path, and he wrote the book on the subject a while ago. Falling in love, staying in love, and all the dynamics of that. So there's for our theme today, which is the next level of partnership in the evolutionary way. Here's a good nutshell little paragraph about it from his book. Here it goes. As you move through your relationships, and particularly if you explore intimacy with several partners along the way, you won't be able to help noticing that patterns emerge. The same issues come up time and time again, even when the new beloved seems to at first be completely different from the one before. This is because the work of relationships is soul work. And until you take up the challenge of self-transformation, it will continue to present itself to you, however hard you try to find an easier path. So so the key phrase there is soul work.
Did I write that?
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, great.
I've always had a phrase for it, which is the difference between the ego dynamic and the soul work is when you're doing the soul work, you work on yourself, work on oneself in the presence of the other. So that whole trying to work on the other to make it more comfortable is no longer as relevant as you're doing your own soul work in the presence of the other, who will invoke it and provoke it in many ways. Okay. Now that I'll do just a big picture overview of the theme. Just the evolution of partnerships and relationships in general, the 4 phases of that. Starting with, this is very broad brush, but in the beginning, it was an extension of property and part of a religious covenant and an arrangement that made, sense in terms of the just the social contracts and the political ones, and unfortunately the woman was usually viewed as part of the man's property in addition to the property and all the advantages of that. Then phase two would be more of a role playing, gender role transaction embedded in the social norms. So more becoming more recognizable as the marriage, we know. And thirdly, a need meeting fulfillment transaction, you're missing half and coming into union with somebody who completes you, including, the needs, being prominent, and you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and that's the harmony of it all. And then fourthly, which is what we're talking about today, it becomes a vehicle for personal growth and evolution, which that's a real shift in the way you relate to the beloved. When you're there together, in all the other ways, practical ways, but the priority is the soul work, the soul growth that's going to come up. Yeah. So now over to our portal for all this today. So maybe you can do a little overview, Malcolm, on your work with couples, with the relationship dynamics.
Yeah, so when I first started studying psychotherapy, I wondered what I was going to specialize in, and I thought what was most interesting to specialize in would be couples. So I did a lot of couples work, and then I did a lot of couples group work. Plus, I took part in when I was married, we were part of a couples group where we would share what was going on in our relationships, and it was pretty unusual to do that in those days. And I realized that there's a great line that's in my book actually that it's not my line. My line is someone else's. It says, "It doesn't so much matter who you marry, because you'll be sure to wake up with someone else the next morning," which is not another person. It's that person is much different from what we projected onto them. So we initially, I think, we go into relationships with a very sort of, it's almost like if any other activity failed as often as relationships, we give it up as a bad job. But we keep going into each relationship. I've got friends who go, "Oh yeah, I think I've met the person this time," and in fact, it's just the same patterns come out again. So there's an exploration in relationships of how we hold our own center and how we're developed and molded by being in relationship with another. And that's a very powerful place to inhabit, because we can't just make the other person wrong. I know when I first went into therapy, I kept having bad relationships that broke down, and I realized that the common factor in these was actually me, and that it wasn't that I kept meeting the wrong people, but something about me was creating an environment that was not very healthy. And I did quite a lot of individual work and then group work before I sort of started to recognize the part I played in all of this.
Mm,
So, yeah.
yeah. And yeah, was there a turning point when your vision of it all shifted?
Um,
Mm,
I don't think there was one individual turning point. I think it was a sort of like it's almost like climbing a really tough mountain that you
yeah.
just keep get sort of like pushing yourself forward and finding the next sort of exploration that's possible. And I think that I hadn't recognized what was essential within relationships, and it started to make a difference. And I think one of the things I learned is that every relationship will teach us something. So we think we can go into a relationship and we're looking for the perfect person, but actually each relationship will affect a different aspect of ourselves. And very often we end up, as the saying goes, with the same lady in a different dress. But we found something in that other. And I think I started to recognize that this idealized woman that I was seeking in my life didn't exist. any more than I was the idealized man, although at times I was, and although at times she was.
Hmm.
But we couldn't inhabit those spaces all the time. And then what to do when things go skewed became the work. That's what I started to get to.
Right, right.
So can you talk a little bit about, I know you explained how couples work became your work, your
Yeah.
passion. Can you talk a little bit about the soul piece of that, the spirit behind the work?
Yes. I think at the end of the day, what I was seeking and what I think we are seeking as those of us who are exploring the evolutionary phase of our humanity, we're seeking to become awake. And for me, the awakening that comes with another is where the magic lies. The places where we are um, either fumbling along and going nowhere, or we are um, looking for sort of passionate drama. And I think for me, the soul work begins when the drama transforms into something else, because the drama is very much where a lot of people, and including me, have lived a lot of their relationship life is in the sort of like the agony and the ecstasy. And when we get past that, then we come to the place where we are actually supporting each other to become whole. And I think that's where relationships become interesting. But often they don't get to that place because the dramas can blow up relationships, or we can get bored within relationships and not actually look for the next phase in. So that for me, that's where the soul retrieval work comes. That we retrieve our souls when we actually are willing to dive deeply into what's going on between us and another and what's our part in it. If we're constantly projecting it onto the other's wrong, the other's not good enough, the other's too good for us, or whatever it is we're projecting, we're never going to get to the place where we're moving through something. But I think when we get to the place where we realize we're in partnership on a spiritual quest together, and
Yeah,
that is the main purpose of relationships, then it starts to become a whole different ballgame.
yeah, and it makes a great catalyst. Like the other becomes a catalyst for your soul growth.
Yes, yeah,
That
exactly.
when you talk about the idealization, that that reminds me of the three phases that you cover. You know, the first phase being the most romantic one, where you see the best in the other, the falling in love phase. So could you briefly cover what those three phases are?
Yeah.
And by the way, Wesley, I think the group needs to be in the background for the recording because I'm seeing everyone. Sorry, go ahead.
So the first phase of relationship is often falling in love, which I call the temporary lifting of critical faculties. So when we fall in love, we see another and they become idealized, and we think we've found a magical being, and we think we found, in my case, a prince, our princess, or our prince, and we override the obvious signs that are there that what we are seeing is not total. And so that falling in love phase will often last anything from weeks to maybe 6 months. Or if you're living in different continents, perhaps it could last a couple of, I know someone who was in love for 3 years in that sort of phase, where they could only see the beauty in the other. We are at some point inevitably going to have to drop into the place of building relations, a bit like the norming, storming, forming, transforming model. We come to the place where we actually have to drop into the relationship and recognize the places where we are at odds with ourselves, where we're at odds with another, and to decide whether we do the work. And I remember a friend of mine saying that in that phase, you keep coming to hurdles and you have to decide whether you're going to jump the hurdle together or not.
Mm,
And that hurdle will often take us into a different phase of being. And then ultimately, what the relationship can become is a place of transformation, which is a place where we are no longer looking for the other to bring us what it is we need, but they are our companions, our soul companions, and they
mm,
can walk by our side and they can reflect for us. And they become places where we don't get away with our different sort of camouflages that we wear within relationships. And learning to lovingly challenge is one of the things that happens. So my latest book is called Slay Your Dragons with Compassion. Cool. Oh God, that's very good. We'll have a photo of that. And that was very much about the recognition that we have to become a lot more skilled in order to have healthy relationships. We have to learn to say our truth, but to say it compassionately rather than to knock the other one. So what I often see in relationships are people sort of like undermining their partner as a way of making themselves feel better, as a way of sort of justifying the way that they're treating their partner. And I think there's a really big skill that comes in that third phase of relationship, in the transformational phase, where we're willing to take each other on in a way that stays loving rather than becomes combative.
Yeah, that's all. That's very well said. Yeah.
So does this happen? Can couples get to that third phase without having the conscious awareness of it in the beginning of the relationship? Like I know
I,
that a big movement right now is to be conscious with your spiritual union.
Yes.
But if they don't have that consciousness in the beginning, can they still achieve that?
I think if they're fortunate, then the consciousness will actually embed itself in them. It will be born in them. And
mm,
so we find that the consciousness comes to us because we are embarking on that journey. It's almost like we get given gifts along the way in that journey. And so I think we don't have to be, in some ways, we're probably better off that way rather than feeling like, I know for myself that in my 30s, I wore white and I sort of like spoke in a very soft voice. And I thought I was one step away from enlightenment. And in that phase, I was hopeless in relationships because I was out of touch with myself. I was embodying what I thought was the spiritual part of myself, but it wasn't the whole part of myself. And I think there's something about wholeness that comes into this, and that we may stumble across or we may forge our way together in relationships to find the container that fits us, where we actually find a rhythm that means we stay alive.
yeah, and it's important that in the three phases that they don't the previous one is not negated. It's very valuable. So when people quote unquote fall out of love, it doesn't mean that the in love was all an illusion and you know to be disregarded because it wasn't real. It's very real in a different way.
Exactly. And the
Yeah,
recognition needs to be that the falling in love phase is a phase, it has value. And
yeah,
actually, if you're in that for quite a while, you get to really feel the essence of the other because you are actually sort of like your defenses are down, your heart's open. But then when that phase moves on, and it will inevitably move on once in a while. I know I did a radio show once on Radio 5, and there was a couple who'd been together 30 years and had never had anything but being in love with each other. And they'd seen that as utterly normal. But for me, that's so strange. Not strange, weird, but strange, unlikely. The reality is that often we reach a certain pinnacle and then we get the opportunity to start doing the work. But in some ways, the work is doing us in the falling in love phase.
yeah,
There's a real value in that falling in love stage, that the
right.
work starts to do us, the work starts to allow us to see the beauty in another human being. Because how would we otherwise get together with another bunch of neuroses like ourselves and try and forge a way together that actually has real meaning and depth?
Right. And the first phase involves archetypes.
Yeah,
The getting in touch with the what what the person represents on an archetypal level,
yes,
which you bring something to life in you, which is the ecstasy of it all. That's the richness of the archetype and the way it resonates as embodied in the other person. And then in phase two, sometimes they'll say, "Oh, you don't see the real me. You see this is just an idea of me. You see, right?
yes.
Like, a lot of confrontation that can happen
I think
with that.
psychosynthesis is valuable in this, in that it talks about us being a tribe, that each one of us is not an individual being who functions in the same way all the time. We pull out different aspects of our being, and we then are there. So, for example, if we're in a work environment, a business environment, we may pull out a part that's tough and strong and able. If we're in a much more vulnerable environment, we may pull out the part that is much more vulnerable and much more able to be wounded.
Mm,
But all of this is part of us as that we are not just one being. It's almost like we're a multitude within each of us as individuals. And you're going to meet another person who is a multitude. And sometimes that person is going to seem like they are the wisest person in the world because there's a connection, there's a soul connection that embodies and allows that wisdom. And sometimes that person, you're going to go, what the hell? Who am I with here? But this is all part of the process of learning to love the wholeness in ourselves and in each other.
yeah. What if the other doesn't have this vocabulary that we're using, and as therapists, it's an occupational hazard to psychoeducate our partners, like big mistake, right?
I think
And
it's
yeah,
I don't think it's the vocabulary is so important. I think what's important is that um, they can inhabit that place within them that can meet us. So Ram Dass puts this very well. He said that when you're in a relationship and you've become awake, and I'm wary of the word of woke and awake these days as well. But when you become awake and the other isn't, you have two choices. One is that you can leave the relationship, and the other is you can choose to be an environment in which the other can awaken at any time, but you're not forcing them into
yeah,
that place with you. So I think that if you feel like you've got somewhere, don't become the big player who's going, look, I've got something and you're an idiot and you don't have it. It's
right.
more that you stay open to the other being with you and also learning to adapt our vocabulary. So if we're speaking,
Yeah,
you're speaking Cedricese and I'm speaking Malcolmese or Deanna's speaking Deannaese, it's like learning to learn each other's languages
yeah,
because there are I don't know how many people there are on the planet, but there's that many languages as well. And we have to learn each other's languages and to be willing
yeah.
to enter the environment of another on their terms
Mm.
sometimes.
I meant like part of what I meant is when it comes to that hurdle of the third phase where you really have to do your soul work,
Yes.
like breakthrough, breakdown time. Um, it it's is it important that both people have a strong vision? Like, because if someone hasn't experienced that third phase and doesn't know it is something to go through, they could just see it as breakdown. They could not know that if you face it, there could be a breakthrough.
I think that's the practice is to actually sort of like allow the sort of like the degeneration to be part of the relationship because it's going to happen.
Mhm.
And whether or not we can stay with it. I think that's the thing is that's the place where relationships often break down.
Yeah,
Is it looks like you're arguing a lot, you're struggling a lot, but actually what's happening is you've come to another hurdle. And it's almost like you have to learn a bunch of new skills. It's almost like a computer game where you go to the next level. And if you
yeah.
learn a bunch of new skills together, then the relationship can go to another level.
And
So
so
on
how
that
important
note,
is it that people have the vision? Like, do they need it or can it be unconscious?
Of course, it can be unconscious. Yeah, it can. Yes.
Okay.
there's a question in the chat. Would the initial red flags be a warning to stay away or a reason to go ahead with the relationship?
Yeah, good question. Yeah.
That's a very good question. Yes. Um, I mean, there are some warnings. For example, if your partner is violent and is showing signs of that at an early stage, you may be very wise to steer clear of them. Or you can spot abusive patterns, and I think that would need to be challenged. But I think you can say we have differences and there are going to be things that are looking like red flags, but there may in fact be not be that. The I Ching or the I Ching talks about the nature of relationships, that the easiest relationship is the one where you're most similar to the other. But the most rewarding relationship, the relationship that can really take you to a really deep place, is the relationship where you're very different and you're having to find a way of navigating those differences with each other.
Yeah. I actually call it a relation canoe instead of a relationship.
Yes.
because the canoe is much more, maneuverable and adaptable, adjustable. It's not a
Yeah.
big, heavy ship that, it takes a lot to turn it. Or
Mm.
relation canoe.
Yeah. I
And
like that.
my experience is that for those relationships that are likely dysfunctional and going to stay that way, they start out in this period of limerence, which is a little different than what you're describing as the first phase, because there's almost an obsessive quality. There's an extreme codependence. So sorting out whether it's limerence or that first phase of falling in love can be very important.
Yeah.
Someone's asking what it means. What does limerence mean?
Limerence is often described as that first 6 months to 2 years where the two of you are completely glommed onto each other. But limerence has a bit of a shadow side. It's more um again, more of the obsessive thoughts, the
No.
stalking, if you will. Um, just not healthy.
Mhm.
So I'll
And
put the proper spelling in chat if anybody wants
And
to
there,
look it
what
up.
we do is we often lose ourselves if you're in that stage
Right.
of ignorance.
Yeah.
So you lose yourself because you're so hungry for the relationship to work that you give yourself away. And Robert Johnson, who wrote the He, She, We, and the Psychology of Romantic Love books,
Yeah.
talks about giving away our gold. And I think often we do that. And someone's written, I think women are conditioned to stay, Xenia has said, I think women are conditioned to stay and work on the relationship. But unfortunately, often it doesn't lead to the spiritual growth. Well, I think that actually sometimes women can bring that gift of holding the space where they're not giving up. But if they're just doing all the work and there's no shift in the relationship, yes, you're right, then it's difficult.
Mhm. Someone recently told me that a red flag, like not on the abusive level, would be if you ask someone about their previous partnership, what did you learn from it? And all they can talk about is the faults of their ex.
Yes.
That in itself is a red flag.
It is. So one of the things I would say to you is if you start a new relationship and you talk about your old one obsessively, you're not giving the relationship the best chance to have a good start because you're still stuck, you're still caught in that codependence with the other, and you're not really ready for a relationship. That's where you are. So
Mhm.
that's one of the things I would say. That's one of the red flags that's there in not at the abusive level, but the level where is that person really available for a relationship?
But then somebody could grow out of it if the grace of the new one starts to take over.
Uh, yes, but I think that there's a danger in one person, often the woman, but I don't want to characterize as the woman or the man or whatever else, um, is really in and is sort of working on it, and
Yeah,
the other is just coasting along with them as well. So I think if you
right.
don't take responsibility for your own actions, then that's a different ball game as well.
Mm, right.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, you know, the negative the negative side of the falling in love phase is, all the things we're reading these days about gaslighting and love bombing, and if that's continually going on, then of course that's a red flag.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah,
I mean, I think when it's like when your neurotic behavior takes over within the relationship and you're not taking responsibility
exactly.
for how you are, then you're expecting an awful lot from the relationship, which it may not be able to deliver.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That the old problem of expecting redemption from one person, which goes against what you were saying about the tribe and the multi-identities.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have a comment that says, I think women are conditioned to stay and work on the relationship, but unfortunately, often it does not lead to the spiritual growth.
Well, there's a difference in working on the relationship and sticking in there come hell or high water. Working on the relationship won't just mean working on yourself, it'll be working on you and the other. And can the other join you in that as well? So if that you're doing all the work, you're probably not in the most useful relationship for you. Whereas I think that what we're looking at these days is, are we both capable of picking up the baton? Are we both capable of that? And do we want to allow ourselves to be transformed, molded within the relationship as well?
And that it is asking a lot too of people's evolutionary courage,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, because actually we're having to forge new pathways, and it's hard.
Yeah.
And there are times when we're going to be, knocked sideways. But I think if we look at it, there are some skills that are really essential within relationship. One is authenticity, and actually, if we can't trust, if we can't speak our truth, if we're shading things, my mum used to talk about white lies, and she used to talk about them as something that was really good. You tell white lies so someone wasn't hurt. But I think we have to learn to tell truth within relationship, where we are showing up with our full presence, and we're willing to actually sort of say what's true for us in a way that doesn't diminish the other, but at the same time holds on to the place where we have wisdom and we're allowing it to manifest. And there's another comment here, which is, can you please say a little bit about the role of sex in the relationship as a possible vehicle of spiritual growth? Well, I think that we're looking at a really big subject here, but let's take a look at it as well. So I think Doris Lessing, who some of you will have heard of, who wrote a lot of wonderful books, also wrote a science fiction series called the Shikasta series. And in that series, there were this much more evolved race that came to Earth and worked without the humans knowing it, worked with the humans to help them develop themselves. And one of the things they said, when they came to sort of a conference to confer about how they were, was that in fact maybe they'd got the sexual part wrong because it was too strong. Now, there's something about sexuality within a relationship that can completely overpower us. We can be with someone who's totally wrong for us because we are lit up within the sexuality of it. And sex can be, well, I think sex runs the spectrum from being rapist and foul abuser sexually to merging with another and actually finding a way to merge with the divine when you're in a sexual relationship. And it goes the
Well,
if the sex becomes sidelined, if it becomes the major event and the other stuff isn't working, but you keep getting hooked on sexuality, that's a place where the relationship will often take a very difficult turn as well. So I think sex becomes something that is a possibility of love. I know for a long time as a man, and the generation I grew up in, sex was my main aim. It was like, the idea was to actually have sex with as many women as possible. And I'm not proud of that now. I'm just saying that this is what I grew up through. And actually it was almost like conquests. And I think there's something around sexuality that is really about surrender. And again, women often know more about that than men. But there's something about the place of surrendering to another, that actually you surrender to the experience where you join with another. And again, this is a wonderful practice within relationships. And this whole practice of Tantra that's been part of our modern sort of psychological movement as well is also in the frame.
mhm. Yeah, and then you get into the area of the body doesn't lie, and there's nothing like sex to bring out the angels and the demons.
Yeah. But can we stay conscious within sexuality as well? And can we make it not a quest for orgasm?
Yeah,
There's nothing wrong with orgasm. But I think if we can make it a quest to truly merge with another, to truly surrender with another, and to,
yeah.
to allow the place that you inhabit between you in sexuality, you're finding something beautiful.
Hmm.
And that's also where for many people with that level of union, that is where the sexual healing can start
Yeah.
for people who have been victimized.
Yes.
Hmm. Hmm.
Question, does the desire diminish with age?
Um, It's interesting. I was out for a walk with a friend of mine yesterday, and he's in his 60s, and he said, "I'm so upset that as I've got older, I no longer have the same sexual drive that I had when I was younger. It's like when I was younger, it was like it was everything. It was like the desire was extraordinary, and it's like there were always adventures to be had with that desire, whether it be with one other or whether it be the exploration of ourselves as well. I think it changes with age." And I think age offers us a possibility of meeting in a different place. Now, I had a therapist when I was younger, when I was in my 20s, called Harvey Carman, who was quite a well-known therapist at the time. And he used to show pornographic films to his clients. You know, they'd come in couples and he'd show sort of all, not so much pornographic, but sexual films. But one of the things he showed was people who were elderly having sex. And it was very different from the young sort of like, sort of thrusting that goes on. And it took me a while to recognize that there was something very beautiful there as well. And if we can find the place where we're not looking for the sort of like the sexual kick, I think there's something very different about our sexuality as we become older. Like for example, I'm no longer driven by the need for orgasm, which is I miss it. I mean, it comes sometimes, but it's like it's not the same as that sort of hunger that's around it. But there can also be a gentleness and a tenderness around it that can be a very different ball game as well.
Yeah, someone said that as men age, they become more like women, that with more of a broad spectrum of sensuality and touch of all kinds, and as you say, not as driven.
I like that actually because I think that
Yeah,
there is something about, I think when I was young, it was just like it was all focused on orgasm and conquest, and it's like that's not, you know,
yeah,
look
and
back and
then
have some compassion for my younger self, but I think there is something about the broader spectrum that you just mentioned.
mhm.
And somebody says there seems to be a common problem in couples where in long-term relationships, the sex tends to diminish.
I think there's an invitation at that stage to find a
Yeah.
different way of sex because when you are driven by sort of it's almost like you're driven by the feeling that you is overwhelming and sort of and passionate and all consuming and dramatic and melodramatic. I think that we have to find something else, and it's finding for me it's about finding that tenderness where we can hold another for a long period of time, where you can caress for a long period of time, where it's not any longer about achieving something, but it's about being together in a sensual, sexual space. And it's not as exciting, but it can be a lot deeper as well.
Mhm.
And I think that touches on the next question, which is, does the desire lessen with one partner when together for a long time, the intimacy?
Inevitably, it will. Inevitably, I think that it's like when something becomes known, it becomes less of a sort of like a passionate desire that's around for you. But I think the invitation is to transform it at that stage. So it's not just about the desire, it's about the practice of love. It's about the practice of deeply connecting with another human being. And love isn't something I was working with a client recently, and he said something about for a while when he'd broken up with his wife, when he got back with his wife, for a while it was really passionate again, and it was like, oh wow, this is so amazing, and then it tailed off, and he's longing for that wild desire to be back, but that's not the answer. The answer is actually to sort of find the place where you can meet in authenticity, and you can meet with lovingness, and you can meet with you can slow it all. I love Leonard Cohen's song "Slow." I've always liked it slow. I never liked it fast. It's not because I'm old. It's not what dying does. I've always liked it slow. Slow is in my blood. And I think there's something about slowing it all down that actually you can truly meet another in a way that perhaps you've never done before. And there's nowhere near as exciting, but can be much deeper and much more of an emotional connection.
He also said in another song that you want to change the way we make love, I want it to stay the same.
Oh, yes. You want to change the way I make love. He was so I mean he was wild as a lover as well, but he was so wise in what he wrote because I think there's something about what I got from him was the slowing down, the sort of like that making love is not about the ultimate orgasm or the ultimate sort of high, it's about the ultimate surrender as we age as well. That's
Right.
the possibility.
So
Well, and it
getting
also takes both partners, maybe not at the same time, but at some point, both partners have to recognize and reckon with the changes that are going to happen as we age.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of resistance to that with both women and men.
Yes.
Mhm.
I think that's true. And actually, in surrendering to that, then we can still feel very alive and very empowered within our sexuality and within our relationship skills. But if you're yearning to go back to what
Yeah.
was, where it was without a great deal of thought, but it was all about passion and drive, that's not the way that we're going to go as we get older.
Yeah.
Try as we may.
Yes.
Because another way of describing the three phases is the basic dialectic of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis.
Yes.
The synthesis is the real joining.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then also Blake, Blake going from innocence experience back to innocence on a higher level.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I think it's true. Um, so
And
Selena says, I wonder if it's something you said for growing the desire for sex rather than starting off with it. I don't think we can choose. I think sometimes a relationship is established because it's almost like there's a hot flame between you and there's nothing you can do to resist that. But I think there's something about growing the friendship that I often advise people to do is to actually grow the companionship. And I remember when I was an estate agent in my 20s and my secretary was in her 50s and she said, the deepest thing we've got that my husband and I have in a relationship is this deep companionship. And I thought, you boring old fart. But as I grew older, I recognized that companionship is actually a very important part of relationship. That actually it's that companionability, the ability to be together with each other and feel like it's comfortable and it's warm. And
because that's what you're left with in the end. If you go the distance, that's what
if
you're
you
left
go the
with.
distance.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So again, the evolutionary history of all this. So back in the day, Middle Ages, let's say, when when the religious paradigm was shared, the becoming a monk or a nun and being married, they're both seen as vocations, right? And the vocation involved, the subduing the ego, surrendering to God, and they were different paths. So there's a big challenge in the third phase of the like a real like surrender of the ego, um, which is actually rare and not easy and very, very challenging, which is why a lot of relationships don't make it to that third phase.
That's right. A lot of relationships don't make it. So
And
Selena's asked an interesting question in her triptych of a question she's asked here. The third part of this is, do you think that initial companionship can grow into more, or without the initial hotness, it's really just wishful thinking? I think actually, if we can form our relationships from a place of closeness and connection, yes, it might grow into more. Each relationship has different strengths and weaknesses. So some relationships will just be that you just want to shag each other senseless. That's one way of having a relationship, and maybe that's fun for a while. It also becomes a bit samey after a while. You're not going to sustain it forever. But there is something about when you truly get to melt with another on other levels, then I think the sexuality can enter in because it becomes the tenderness rather than the hotness that she's describing there. And I could just like to, if I can, at this phase, just say what I thought was the main thrust of falling in love, staying in love, with the four pillars of relationship, the places where we have to connect if we're going to form a long-term relationship. So it's one thing to say that there's a great line in an Arthur Leon love song that says, "Yeah, I heard a funny thing. Somebody said to me, that I could be in love with almost everyone." And I think at one level that may be true, that there is this sort of like this capacity to see the beauty in each being. I've just finished a book by Matt Haig called The Life Impossible, where this woman becomes awakened through something in the sea that sort of like that brings her a sort of like that she's attuned to everything after a while, and then she sees that everybody is love, but we're not necessarily there where we are. And I think that we need to have to recognize that there are different ways of operating. So the first level, the first of the pillars that I look at is the pillar of the physicality. Now, the physicality isn't just sex. The physicality is also being able to be with another out in public or to hang out together, to be able to be with each other physically. If that's not there at all, then the relationship doesn't have a lot of chances in the long term. Then the next level from that is the level of the emotional level, where if we're going to be in a relationship that's truly going to allow us to unravel and become who we are, we're going to have to find a way of being where we are allowing each other's and our own anger, our sadness, our happiness, um, all the different aspects of emotion, and can our partner contain that without squashing it, without making it wrong? So for it, it's very powerful sometimes if you can be with your partner who's angry, and believe me, everybody gets angry sometimes. So if you can be with your partner who's angry and not feel like you've got to push them away. So I know in my shining white phase in my 30s, I was with someone and she became really angry a lot of the time, and that was a real affront to my shining white sort of self, who was going, "Oh, please don't do that. This is horrible. This is wrecking the vibes of the relationship." That's really immature. I can look back on it now and recognize the immaturity of it, but there's something about being able to be with each other and being able to encompass sadness with each other. So sometimes we can allow the place of grief to be with us without having to hide it away, without having to be all right. So our partner becomes someone with whom we can practice that. At an intellectual level, you're going to want to be able to talk about the world. You're going to want to be able to talk about what inspires you, perhaps the books that have inspired you, the music that inspires you. You're going to want to be able to connect with your partner to share inspiration and to share common thinking and to help shape our thinking. And the final level is the spiritual level, which doesn't mean we have to have exactly the same practices, but there's something about within the spirituality of recognizing that we are more than this lump of flesh and skin and bones that inevitably is a temporal being. But there's also recognizing the eternal nature and the exquisiteness and the divinity of the person you're with. And I think when you get to that level, you start to get to the level where actually you have the capacity to go way beyond what we had originally learned in relationships.
Mm.
That's
Well,
awesome.
yeah.
And there's a big question, Malcolm.
Yeah.
Where do you think love comes from?
Now, there's a lovely question. I like that. I've never even thought about that before. So it's a great one. Ultimately, this is going to sound terribly new agey, and I'm really not new agey anymore. I used to be, but everything is love. I think that actually our essence is love. It's almost like what do we do to push love away or to protect ourselves from love, even though love is what we're longing for. But if we are able to accept ourselves and the other the way we are, I think that's the place where we nurture and encourage love. Ultimately, it's all love. But I've touched that at times, sometimes on psychedelic stuff and sometimes in meditation, sometimes even in life. But it's a rarity rather than I live in that place. But when we do experience, or when I have experienced that sense of the awesomeness of love, which isn't the dramatic sort of like "I love you" and sort of like the clash of thunder and cymbals. It's more sort of like the acceptance, the recognition that you're with another, as Sir George Trevelyan puts it, divine droplet of divinity. That we are all divine droplets of divinity. I think that's where love is, but we have to reclaim it. It's almost like we've got to. It's like Rodin talked about with his sculpture of finally, he takes this block and forms it into a sculpture. He said the sculpture was always there. It's getting rid of the stuff around it, and I think the love is always there. And it's like getting rid of the stuff that alienates us or pushes us away from love.
Mm. Mhm. Mm. That was very poetic.
Yes.
What do you think about or feel about the etheric level that what we call in the e-therapy land non-local presence, and yeah, the etheric level that doesn't actually depend on the four pillars, which are nice to have, but when there's actually essence to essence, otherwise known as soul mating, that can happen under any conditions and circumstances.
I've often heard a sort of a saying that your soulmate can very easily become your cellmate. So there is something about that actually there are soulmate connections, and there's no doubt that in our lifetime, we will sometimes stumble across another with whom there is that sense of, I've known you forever. And I have a number of people like that in my life. I've known you forever. And I think the essence to essence comes out there as well. But I think we have to learn to dance with that, because it's a very it's the word I was going to use was fragile, but it's not the right word. It's a very sensitive,
Yeah,
ethereal
it's
thing,
yeah,
that
that's
has to be allowed to find its way.
yeah.
It's almost like we have to allow life to
That's
bring.
why they said etheric, like that dimension that can be said it's the strongest. There's
Yes.
this beautiful book called Love is Stronger Than Death by Cynthia Bourgeault, and she was involved with a monk and they had a passionate love affair. After he died, the whole book is about the relationship after he died.
Uh-huh. That's lovely.
That's what I mean by not depending on the four, pillars of that, the tangible ones.
Well, this is interesting. This is probably going to sound slightly weird, but it is the reality that when I wrote my book, Slay Your Dragons with Compassion, I wrote it because it was written on the back of my daughter's suicide. My daughter Melissa took her own life in 2014. And I started writing the book in 2018. And it took me 7 months to write it. And I wrote it with my friend Ben Craig, who was a very good architect, helped create the structure for the book. But what I felt was that my relationship with Melissa while I was writing the book came alive. And I
Yeah.
felt like I knew her more in that process of writing the book. It's almost like that sounds so new agey and sort of, but the reality is I felt like she was with me. And I felt like the book was partly hers. It wasn't all about her, but a lot of it was about her and what I'd learned in the process of her dying and how to
Mhm.
handle adversity. So I think there is something that goes beyond our human comprehension that's
Yeah.
there within love, and that love can be very alive, even beyond the gates of death. So I think that's absolutely true, and that's been my experience also.
Yeah.
Yes.
Uh, yeah. My heart partner said, "In the next life, can we live in the same country?"
You should say it's working so well because we've got this distance between us.
So we're running out of time. There's a very profound level. I want to know, like, really taking it to a deep level. I want to know what you think of this quote. Like, now that we're on a roll, because it's very startling what Jonathan Bishop says here. So he says love between two persons, if that is possible, has to include a mutual consent to endure the relevant death together and not at each other's expense. And the presence of death is unavoidable as soon as somebodyhood comes up at all. A relation founded on life alone would have to limit itself to the gratifying identifications of the immediate we. But we call these affairs not marriage. So, what do you make
Wow.
of that?
Wow. In words of two letters or more. I think that's very deep,
Yeah,
and I do think there is something about that we are educated by love. So I know this might sound slightly tangential, but it's not. When I took ayahuasca, which is a plant medicine, I and if someone had said this to me beforehand, I would have said, "You're an idiot." I was educated by the plant. And I think what we're looking at here is being educated by death and educated by the larger
yeah.
concept of life around us. And there is no question that the plant took me to places that I didn't know how to go on my own.
Mhm.
And we have a great deal of possibility of understanding the wholeness of this environment that we're in. We are not the illusion of this separateness that we think of. And therefore, within that will also come this concept of death being part of life. And for me, my relationship with Melissa has deepened after her dying. And
Mhm.
if someone had said that to me beforehand, I would have thought, you're a fantasist. But actually, that's not the reality. The reality is that it, death is a part, it's the shadow part of life. But I firmly believe that actually we are eternal beings. I mean, and I think if we believe that, then death becomes a part of our being. And one of the chapters in my book, Slay Your Dragons, is about befriending death. And I ran a death group for about 10 years. And one of the things that happened during that group was that one of the women in the group died during the course of that ongoing group. Not in the group, but she was dying. And we as a group shared her dying process with her, which was one of the most profound things we could ever have done. And she was really an educator. She was a Buddhist and she'd done a lot of work on herself. And there was something about her dying process that educated her and the rest of us as well. So I think death is an inevitable part of the question of love and life.
Yeah, you mentioned the shadow work, and that could be a whole other hour just
Yeah.
on the
Yes.
just on the
Right.
dealing with the shadow on both sides.
Yes.
Yeah.
Someone said, why did I feel the need to take that drug? Was it after Melissa's death? And was Melissa always dying? No, Melissa wasn't always dying. She had a really serious bipolar episode where she got incredibly high for a while and then got incredibly depressed and then took her own life at 33 years old. Why did I feel the need to take a drug? It's not. It's interesting because we look at it as drug. And actually, we've got this whole concept of drug. If you look back into the old tribes and rituals and ceremonies, plant medicine has always been a part of the shamanic journey. I've only taken it once. I took it once. I took it probably 15, 20 years ago in Peru. Um, but it was an experience that actually educated me. And it was like I want to be educated. I definitely don't want to lose myself in drugs. I'm not interested in getting high. I'm interested in becoming whole, and I'm interested in discovering the whole of the picture of who I am, of what life is, and what we're all about.
Mm. Okay, 3 minutes to go.
Anybody have a final question?
Yeah, there were lots of great comments in the chat.
Well, that's great. I'm really touched by the comments about your brother taking his life at 33, Tanya, and Selena. I respect the decision of anyone who takes their own life. Yeah. You didn't answer why though, in terms of why did I? It was on offer. We were with shamans and we were sort of exploring and this arose and I said yes to it because I felt like it was an experience. And I learned an awful lot on it, but I don't recommend it for everyone. And I
Right.
think the people who take it every weekend are really not honoring. I think the place of ritual is really important. My therapy groups are much more ritualistic groups than they used to be because in the ritual comes a lot of the richness as well. And read Death. Have you heard of Stephen Jenkinson? Yes, I've met Stephen Jenkinson. He's deep and inspiring. The Grief Walker, absolutely. We had him at Alternatives, which is a series that I used to run in at St James's Piccadilly in London. And Stephen Jenkinson came and did an evening with us then on grief and on death, which was wonderful.
Hmm. Well, we squeezed a lot into the hour.
You did, and it was really lovely dialoguing with you guys as well. So, and also having the chat coming through as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really want to say because Celine's just said some people gained a similar opening through mind through LSD. It can open the creative and spiritual mind. Yeah, it can. We can actually be switched on with that. One of my teachers was Ramdas, who was had taken 1,000 tabs of acid as a Harvard psychology professor, and then became Ramdas, and he was educated by the drug. And yet at the same time, he gave it to his guru, and the guru then dropped 30 tablets. And Ram Dass go, oh my God, what's going to happen? Absolutely nothing, because he was bigger than that state where the LSD was going to change him. He was already awake and not in need of it.
Yeah.
And Santu, what your teacher was Ramdas. Yeah, I was very lucky that in running alternatives, I invited Ramdas a number of times to come and speak, and I went on retreat with him a number of times, and I had a close relationship with him, and a beautiful being, and it was one of the great blessings of my life that man was part of my life for quite a long time.
He was a good hugger. I had 3 hugs with him.
Oh, beautiful! It's a beautiful man, and
Yeah.
also he wasn't full of his own ego. It's that he was always said, I am the servant. Ram Dass means servant, a servant of God. And he always
Yep.
said, I'm the servant, I'm not the teacher. My guru is the
He
teacher.
did a tour that he called Nothing New from Nobody Special.
That's great. Yeah, lovely, lovely.
Anyway, the we could easily go on for maybe
Yeah.
we'll have to do a part two sometime.
That would be great. But really lovely. Thank you for inviting me on this. It's been really
Thank
enjoyable
you.
So
dialoguing.
the yeah, very
Yeah.
well spoken. You're very eloquent.
Uh,
Um, so the closing blessing in that big picture, universal love you mentioned, the closing blessing is, may unconditional love emanate from our hearts, allowing healing light to permeate our planetary home, encircling the earth out into the cosmos. So that covers everything.
Yes.
you're done.
Whatever we didn't cover is now covered.
Thank you.
And to heal our troubled world by opening our hearts in our own spheres, in our own smaller worlds.
Lots of great compliments in the chat, Malcolm.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's been it's again, it's the result of the relationship. So we actually sort of like we had a little groove together, and
Right.
from there comes stuff that I don't even know I'm going to speak about. But actually
Yeah.
we engage, and then it comes through as well.
Yeah, when you keep your heart open in the face of relational adversity, you
Yeah.
become someone like you.
God forbid. So